the requirements of some background reading, I believe, and some exposure to them is probably necessary if we are going to benefit from any of these discussions, because poetry must not only be spoken about, it must also be read and imbibed to some extent. So inshallah, before we start the next cycle of talks, which will begin with the poets of Tasawwuf, I think it will be useful, at least one attempts to read some extracts from, for example, Mantiq al-Tayr of Ata, The Conference of the Birds, or to read Hadiqat al-Haqaiq of Hakim Sinai, or to read some extracts from Ibn Farad upon knows Arabic, or in translation Nicholson's book. I think is because it has a literary flow to it and literary charm to it, it would be useful to do that. And I would ask, inshallah, that if you have the time, that perhaps you can at least read one or two. So, today I would like to discuss something else, another subject, which goes also within the chronological sequence, and comes, I think, at a good stopping point for us. That is really the technology, as it were, of the inner self. How has this evolved, and how did it reach the beginnings of certain principles and concepts that subsequently guided nearly all Muslim doctors of the self, Atba al-Nafs, in the subsequent periods of Islam, and leading really up to the modern, if not just before the pre-modern period, when the entire mind of the Muslim, the entire mind of the movement was seized by alien values and alien concepts, alien notions of right and wrong, of good and evil, alien notions that have had no bearing on the future happiness of that person. And it is this, I think, that is critical for us to understand, because the recognition of not only the self in terms of the mechanical stages of its evolution, but also the ailments of the self, the remedies for those ailments, why a self is out of balance, why the self that is out of balance cannot possibly aspire to reaching the heights of inner knowledge and to reaching a level of completion and perfection appropriate to it. And we have to admit also that we are living in the modern world. We're not living as an adjunct to the Muslim world of 1,000 years ago. And part of the process of recapturing the essence of the deen is to understand and then to internalize the forms in which the self expresses itself. This, I think, is one of the great successes, inshallah, of Shaykh Fadhlalla and his school, and that is to try to understand the self within notions and within concepts and frameworks that were established in the period that we have been talking about. In fact, I would say that the Muslims, the early Muslims, those who were in true Iman and true Tawheed, reached an understanding of the self and the ethics associated with that understanding 1,000 years ago. And it is truly unfortunate that we have neglected or forgotten even the basis for recognizing the modalities that constitute a healthy self, and the modalities that are necessary for a healthy self to aspire to perfection and completion. The two greatest writers or authors, or in the case of Imam Ghazali, Arifs, who discussed this, were Imam Ghazali himself in Ihya al-Din, where an entire book has been devoted to the diseases of the self, the diseases in the form of barriers that must be overcome. And barriers not in the sense of just stating that there are barriers. For example, greed is a barrier, but what does greed really mean? What does anger really mean? What does envy really mean? What does malice really mean? These we take for granted that we know their meaning, but unfortunately we know their meaning in the current, in contemporary sense. Greed, envy, malice, anger, hypocrisy, love of self, grandeur and haughtiness. these meant something else before. And unless we understand what we really mean when we talk about the barriers to the self, we will not be able to begin the process of self-healing that ultimately, inshallah, will lead to the road to the station of completion. And before Imam Ghazali, about 150 years ago, there was a psychologist, who was also influenced by Shaykh of Fadhlalla Haeri, but who himself was not and has not been associated with tasawwuf as such. But he certainly was the harbinger, as it were, of all subsequent Muslim understanding of psychology. And that person is Ibn-Miskawayah. Shaykh Fadhlalla, I think, refers to him in his book, Journey of the Self, as being one of the earliest to develop the inner technology of the self. And Ibn-Miskawayah, in his analysis of the self, its diseases, its stations from really a practical approach, even a medical approach, was a necessary for Imam Ghazali to develop his own elaboration of life. So by the end of this period, by the end of the 12th, 13th century, the Muslim world was really a complete system in terms of its inner understandings, in terms of its inner knowledge, and in terms of its outer actions and its outer force. And this was the true nation in Tawheed, and it was a true nation that was imbalanced, a true Ummah al-Wasṭa. The psychology of Ibn-Miskawayah was absorbed into nearly all the systems of teaching that became part of the tools of trade, as it were, of the great Shia. It was not only the teaching of inner tahdeeb, that is inner grooming, was not limited to just the actions that we associate with tasawwuf or with ma'rifah. That is the actions of khalwa, the actions of dhikr, of collective invocation. It was more than that. It was a question of developing the ethics and the morality of a person, of the adept, in order for him to be able to understand his true self, and not to assume that he understood himself simply by accepting the norms that were required to move up the ladder. And all of the great insights into the way in which the self tricks, the way in which the self manipulates, the way in which the animal self continues to pull the adept down, was an important element in the whole teaching process of all the great tariqas, and became established as part of their inner processes. So Ibn-Miskawayah's book, which is called Tahdhib al-Akhlaq wa Tathhir al-A'raf, which means basically the purification of ethics and morals, or to some extent one can call it the ethical psychology of inner Islam. He has certain insights that are truly profound, even in their modern sense, because of the way in which a person begins to recognize that the various traumas and problems and complexes and issues and barriers that he has can be seen either in the system of modern psychology and all of its attendant issues, or can be seen from an entirely opposite different light, which is the only way in which the journey of the self is towards Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the self that is out of balance cannot aspire to such a journey. So the first act of a person who wishes to embark on this journey is to recognize the nature and the construct of the self and how it is out of balance. He says that the self understands, and in contrast to the senses, he juxtaposes senses which can respond to external stimuli and can relate to the external world as such, the world of the senses, the world of vision, the world of sound, of sight, of touch. He juxtaposes the self to that, and he says the self is that entity which understands the reasons behind harmony or disharmony in the person or of the senses. So if the sense is out of balance, or if perceptions are out of balance, cognition is supposed to be that faculty that puts it back in balance. And it is that essential feature of the self, that it is an entity that maintains a balance between extremes. And these extremes in themselves are in the form of a spectrum. We'll discuss that later, inshallah, to see how, for example, courage and cowardice are basically one when seen from the vision of Tawheed, but are separate when seen in their atomistic qualities. And the modern mechanism, the modern systems of psychology deny the spectrum. The modern system of psychology look at each issue in itself, try to identify it, categorize it, and then to treat it. But when you see the problem in terms of a spectrum, the way and the approach becomes entirely different. It says the self, its main virtues that it aspires to is to escape the pressures imposed on it, that is, to escape the pressures leading towards imbalance and disharmony caused by the other aspect, which is the physical aspect. And this can only be done by its constant purification, its constant gleaning from it all of the aspects that lead to imbalance and lead to disharmony. He says, one of the gifts, the uncounted gifts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is the gift of free will. And that free will itself, that is given to us, is really divided into two. That is, we have a will towards virtue, which leads us to goodness and felicity, leads us to khair and sa'adah, and its opposite, which is the vices, what we consider the vices. Vices are not vices per se, they are not sins per se. They are the opposite of what we aspire to in terms of goodness. Again, it's a spectrum. And looking at things, looking at affairs like that, in the form of a spectrum, allows us then to understand that the balance is what is the purpose of the whole course of action that leads us, inshallah, upwards on the path towards greater knowledge and greater illumination. It says that there are three forces that govern the direction of the self. The first force, and you think it's the highest force, it is the highest in terms of its qualities, in terms of its proximity to the forces that govern creation, is the power of the self relating to reflection, discrimination, insight into the realities. And he calls that the الناطقة, القوة الناطقة, or the discursive force, the expressive force. The second force, he compares that to a lion. He compares the first force to the king. So the first force that acts on a person or the self is the force that causes us to reflect, to be discursive, to think in the spiritual sense, to think in terms of structures and orders. And this force is the force that is the discursive or the expressive force. The second force, he compares that to the lion. It is a force that leads towards anger, leads towards control. It has both a positive and a negative side to it. And the third force is the force related to the natural appetites. The second one he calls the sab'iyya, that is related to sab'a, or the lion. And the third force that leads to or that pushes us towards the physical, he compares that to the animal spirit. So we have the quwwa natiqa that leads to, whose paradigm, as it were, is kingship. We have the quwwa sab'iyya, whose paradigm is the lion. And the third force that acts on a person is a quwwa bahimiyya, whose paradigm is the animal. And these three forces are within us at the point of creation. And it is the balance between these forces and the struggle between these three forces, that the struggle between the king, the lion and the pig, that is the determinant cause for our problems, our insecurities, or their lack. That is, these are the ones that cause us to be able to focus on what is good, what is virtuous, and the absence of that causes us to veer away into the path of error and ignorance. And the middle force, which is the force of the line, or the force that allows us to aim towards anger and control, has its positive and its negative side. So if you look at it again as a spectrum, the self moves from being under the sign, as it were, of kingship, that is the sign of lordship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or it can move right to the other side to being under the sign of an animal or a pig, which is under the complete dominance of his physical appetites and his physical requirements. The key to all of that is to achieve a balance and then to have one dominate the other. And it should be in a sliding scale, that the dominance of kingship must be over that of the lion, and the lion that over the pig. That does not mean, which is again looking at it from another perspective, it does not mean that the forces that push us towards physical needs, that push us towards fulfilling certain physical demands, have to be denied. These forces exist, but they must not be allowed to dominate. So the whole process of inner control, of the inner technology of the self, is to have this gradation, so that we have an absolute kingship that allows us to use the force of anger, of control, in its good and bad sides, in order to dominate the third one. He says that the first force, that is the force of kingship, leads in terms of its virtues, the virtue of wisdom or hikmah. The second force, when controlled and directed properly, that is the force of the lion, or the force that leads to anger and control, can, if properly imbalanced, lead to the principle of ikhfa, or subtlety. And the third force, the force that leads to the animal guide, if it's controlled, its opposite comes into being. So that comes under the umbrella of generosity. So the last force, that is the control of the physical appetites, if we are able to control them, creates in itself a virtue. So if, for example, the physical appetite demands that I drink now or eat now, the control of it and the dominance of it allows me to be generous. So generosity is a mechanism by which the opposite of trying to hog it or to hoard it is manifested. And once these three forces, that is the force that leads to wisdom, the force that leads to subtlety, and the force that leads to generosity, are in proper balance, they lead to the fourth virtue of a true person in Tawheed, which is adala, or justice. And the combination of these four are the person or the psyche in balance. The balance between wisdom, between justice, between generosity, and between subtlety. And the opposite of these are the vices, again in their categorical form. So the opposite to wisdom is ignorance. The opposite of generosity is miserliness, and so on. But it's within a spectrum. And the balance is not to be over generous in order to be in a situation where you lose all you have, or to be miserly, but to strike it in between. Therefore, he categorizes under the master category of wisdom virtues such as intelligence, memory, understanding, or al ta'aqqul, speed of understanding, clarity of mind, and ease of learning. These are necessary for a healthy person, a healthy psyche, to be able to move towards a station of wisdom. That there is no point aspiring to be, say, I'm going to move towards hikmah or knowledge by not being quick, for example, or not being sufficiently intelligent to absorb the information that's given to you, or to memorize, or to reflect. The second one, that is the force that leads to the virtue of subtlety, or the virtue of generosity, has as its principles modesty, leads to modesty if it's in balance, which is haya, leads to patience, leads to, and this I think the first time I have read this in any text, leads to what he calls hurriya, which is freedom or liberty. But it's not the liberty in the sense that we think of it. It's liberty for a person to be able to earn his or her keep. That is necessary in order for you to be able to aspire to a station of subtlety and generosity. You don't do that if you are in a state of unable to work, for example, or if you're unable to be in a state of material balance. Acceptance, that is, that you accept the lot that has befallen you, you do not strive against it all the time. Orderliness is required. You should be in a state of wara, which is abstinence also, and you should also be seeking a station of demanding tranquility and peace around you. And the last force, which is the animal force, when tried and controlled and pushed towards the virtues, becomes the force that allows you to go into, to have confidence, to have concern, to have steadfastness, to have forbearance, and to have tranquility. Because, again, looking at it in terms of a spectrum, once in control allows you to improve that until it becomes a virtue. And lastly, the combination of these three forces that leads to justice also has as its principle, from justice, the just self emanates the friendly self, the intimate self, care for others, care for relatives, rewarding others, judging accurately and correctly, ibadah, doing one's ibadah in a proper function is a capability and is an attribute of a self that is both wise, is steadfast, is generous, and is in a state of balance. All of these come down to, funnel down to the self that has these basic four features, four structures that combined together in a proper way allow it to be receptive to the divine message. And he says the whole purpose of all of this, Ibn-Miskawayah's book, is to be able to create a system whereby you can move on the path of more and more inner enlightenment. And inner enlightenment does not come to itself. That does not commence the process of inner brooding before it goes on. He then talks about the Sana'at al-Akhlaq, which can be best, I can only translate it as the technology of ethics. And he says that the finest technology, or the finest Sana'a, industry, as it were, is the one that improves the ethical characteristics of a person in order to allow him to reach Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So technology to him is really that which allows us to move on in order to understand and to be in a station of proximity. It has nothing to do with utilitarian benefits in our physical world. Again, that does not mean that there is no use for him for gadgets and things that benefit man. His main concern is to recognize that all action, the emanation, the source of all action, must be in that one way towards recognition and knowledge of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I think all anyone has to do it is to compare the current priorities, which are the priorities that are entirely opposite. That is technology seen in a utilitarian way, where there is no purpose to it for inner attainment. The technology that we have now, including the inner technology of psychology, for example, or modern psychiatry, is not geared towards creating a person in balance. Is not geared towards creating a person in balance who is moving toward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's geared towards another system of knowledge, another system of understanding completely. And he says in his book that the perfection of man is at two levels. The completion of a person as he reaches a state of balance can be at two levels, and is governed again by two forces. The first force he calls the knowing force. That is the force that leads to knowledge, and that is governed by the heart and the reason. And the second force he calls that the quwa al-alima, the knowing force. And the second force is the quwa al-amila, the active force. The first force, he says, that leads towards knowledge, that leads towards greater and greater enlightenment, is not really the concern. Outer actions can be controlled and dominated in order to be able to reflect back in terms of inner states. The knowing force strives for knowledge and is patient in its search until certainty is reached. I think also it reflects on us, inshallah, that all kinds of setbacks, all kinds of problems, all kinds of obstacles and impediments. And unless one is patient and recognizes that knowledge does not come in one fell swoop, it comes incrementally, it comes in a discontinuous way, or it will come in leaps and bounds. But it does not come all at once, and stops and starts. The requirement for a self that is imbalanced, moving towards knowledge, is the necessity of patience in order to have finality when it reaches the divine presence. And he says the acting force, that is the force that controls outer action, is the one that he is mainly concerned with, and that is how do you organize a person's power, a person's actions, in order to enhance his ability to perfect the virtues. And this mechanism by which the outer world, we respond to the outer world, and we recognize that the outer world impinges on us, is to some extent neglected by some or most of us. It is, we deny the reality of the need to be in balance with the outer world in order for us to be able to commence the inner journey. And I find that there are sometimes discrepancies, enormous discrepancies, between private states that are maintained in for certain periods of time, for certain spans of time, that do not have a sense of continuity either. And I think the source of that must be the unwillingness to realize and recognize the imbalanced self as we move into this realm of inner understanding. That is, the imbalanced self cannot truly be a self that will be able to move along the path. And that's why many of us go up and down, and go up and fall out, or just drop out at a very early stage. It is because of our inability to admit that the self needs to be repositioned and realigned and reoriented in a real sense, not just in a metaphorical sense, but in a real sense for us to be able to continue. So that the journey for the completed self, as all the great masters, and I don't think he was not certainly a man who was known for his station or for his exercise. He in fact came from, he admits in his autobiography, from a very, I would say, debauched background. He spent his youth in all kinds of goings on, all kinds of terrible activities, and he had a huge spiritual crisis in his 20s, to wander and then find a person, and he does not name his Shaykh, but the person who guided him back into the path for nearly 10 or 12 years. His seerah, or his path, was really that of a complete revolt, or a complete revulsion of a station which he was in before. It was a station of complete wallowing in physical excess. And I think, to some extent, that gives him the right and the privilege to talk about it, because he talks about it from his own experience. He says the complete self seeks its completion in the permanence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is, once it recognizes that, it begins to become more and more perfected. And as we recognize that permanence is only to be found in proximity to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this allows us to enhance our ability to receive illumination, to receive. The whole thing is to be able to reach a point where the acceptance becomes as a result of the balanced self. And again, there's a subtle difference between being self-balanced and being a self that has reached a certain station. Certain station is where the entity has arrived, but the inner constituents of that entity is his main concern. How does the inner mechanism function for it to get to that point? And it is the recognition that permanence is what it seeks, and there is no permanence in the physical, but there is only permanence in the spiritual. And that permanence only comes as a result of absolute submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Then illumination begins to happen. And the end result of illumination is basically to confirm through mushahada, through unveiling the reality that you have already accepted by the self-imbalance. Of course, he says that the physical pleasures also give a sense of temporary satisfaction, but they can never be permanent. So the complete self, the self that is either or that is happy or in felicity, is not the self that is contented at the physical level. And the world has turned topsy-turvy. There is no way in which balance and satisfaction in modern times is not equated with the need for certain levels of physical and material comfort. It is not, the whole world now, including the Muslim world, is organized along that principle. And that principle, Ibn-Miskawayah has said 1,000 years ago, it's a principle that cannot lead to anything except greater and greater pain. It might lead to temporary state of happiness. But this constant striving for a state that is not possible, and the pain that comes from longing for that, is the natural condition of those who aspire to certainty in the world. And he says this is the view of the ignorant masses and their manipulators. From those days you recognize that the manipulation of the physical demands and needs of the masses, and the way in which the pig overcomes the lion, who overcomes the king, is the desire and direction of all dictators, all rulers, all leaders, is the same as happens now. But now they are in control, and they seem to be in absolute control. Unless there is an inner reworking of the mechanisms by which we understand and the mechanisms by which we judge, we are unable to understand, we are unable to comprehend the true passage of the self. He starts also in his book, he does not only analyze the stations of the self or its needs and its problems, he also spends a lot of time on how the first thing he starts with is the program for what he calls the child must be taught love of dignity. He must feel a sense of dignity, but not from possessions. This dignity must come from understanding that all goodness, all khair comes from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Parents, elder siblings, family must always praise all that is good and goodness as such. They must always reproach the child if there's a love of excess, especially of food, drink or clothing. Try to control and deny in him a sense of covetousness and hoarding. They should have a sense, instill in him or her, a sense of balance and moderation. They should also control the child in terms of the way and the manner in which he eats, and eating to him and the conduct of people during meal times, and the relationship of people with food to him is a very important element, which when it is out of balance causes great disharmony and causes great anxieties in people. And I think again, if one looks at all some of the modern psychological problems are to some extent food related. All these modern problems that apparently overachieving young people suffer from are all food disorders, eating disorders, and the relationship that we have with food is a very, very defining element as to how we conduct ourselves with others as well as how we recognize ourselves. I mean, the whole concept of fast food, for example, or eating alone, or TV dinners, without really specifying it, the modern mind is to some extent dominated by the relationship with food. So if you read, Ibn-Miskawayah in abstract, and you say this person, all he talks about is how people should behave and the relationship with food. It is basically denying the fact that modern life is constructed around the relationship with food. He also says some very, very practical examples about how overindulgence in anything, like meat for example, is bound to create imbalance. He says, at all costs, do not expose your child to alcohol. Do not expose your child to alcohol or to places where alcohol is seen. Again, in this day and age, it is next to impossible for children not to be exposed to alcohol, not to see alcohol. And it is not only from the point of view, of course it is, but it is not seen from the point of view of the fact that it's a forbidden element, but that it's an element that causes tremendous imbalance in the self and pushes it in certain directions, which allows certain facets that are to be dominated to dominate. And this upside down perceptions of what constitutes order and balance is regrettably the stuff of modern times. And the reason I'm going back to this way is because he distills to a very large extent, and in a very concise way. The book is not very big, it's about maybe 150 pages, things of Muslim or Islamic psychology, inspired by a person who must have gone through a tremendous process of awakening and repentance, and therefore recognized that the Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the way of inner grooming and inner enlightenment, and the way of inner enlightenment is the way of the self-imbalance. This aspect of it, I also must admit, is not frequently mentioned, at least not in modern times by what I have read or have been exposed to, except Shaykh Fadhlalla. And he recognizes that modern man who aspires to be in a state of inner enlightenment cannot begin the process by denying that he comes from a background where his psyche has been severely disturbed. And it applies to all of us. It not just applies to some of us or to new entrants to the path. It applies to us all the time. And the point about this whole exercise is to tip the balance in favor of the lordship power, the power that drives us towards kingship, over the power that drives us towards the surrender to our physical appetites. And our physical appetites, again, it is not simply a denial of them. He does not say, switch off the TV. There is a purpose to the physical. And the purpose of the physical is to deny the absence of it. That is, he says, for example, when we eat, when we take pleasure in eating, it should be the pleasure in satiating a hunger. And once that hunger is satiated, that pleasure of eating should disappear. A healthy person should not eat simply because food is present, or he should not eat simply because it's meal times. A healthy person would eat only to reduce or eliminate a state of hunger. So the pleasure that comes from submitting to the physical is primarily and mainly in order to create the nourishment for a body that's necessary for its balance. So food to him is basically a spiritual medicine. It's a medicine for the body. And when seen that way, you don't, when somebody has a headache, you take one aspirin, you don't take 50 tablets. This way, I think, if we begin to reorient ourselves this way, you'll find that our predecessors, our ancestors, even those 50 years ago, were far more imbalanced than we were. And those who grossed out on this or that pleasure were few and far between. Nowadays, the primacy of the physical is total. And you can't approach tasawwuf or approach inner enlightenment in a state where the external primacy is there unless you bring yourself back into balance. He says the main problems that the self experiences when it begins to go out of balance is the contradictions that exist between what it purports to be virtues and the reality of his actions. This causes tension. And the tension, for example, between a courageous man who is genuinely courageous and the need to show courage causes tension. And while the need to show courage may point to courage on the part of that person, it is not necessarily the feature itself. The pretense to be generous, or the act of being generous under certain conditions, may create the illusion of generosity. But that person knows it is an illusion. The world around him sees a generous person. But if he's doing it in order to achieve certain ends, generosity ends. And these tensions in itself between what it recognizes to be the virtue of balance and the need to act in a way that establishes that virtue causes anxiety and causes problems. He also talks about the causes of how the self begins to harm itself, as it were. And primarily he relates it to the uncontrolled passions and desires, the drive towards oppression, the harm that comes from error and the sadness that attaches to it, and what he calls shaqa or violence. Now these categories again do not match the Maslow's hierarchy of needs or whatever our modern psychiatrists versions of what constitutes healthy and an unhealthy person. He's talking about the person who is out of balance as it relates to tawheed, not as a person who is out of balance as it relates to his relationship with his grandmother or his uncle or whatever, or his mother and father. It is completely unrelated. The principle of balance is not human only. It is not, the cause of the imbalance is the cause of distancing from the divine. It is not caused by a person because of his or her complexes from childhood or whatnot. Because the person is distanced from the divine, the solution is not to look at the erratic behavior of that person. The solution is to try to go back to the form of balance that he needs to maintain and push him in that direction. Once the person who is harming himself recognizes that he's out of balance, or once he diagnoses that he's out of balance, then the push must be to bring him back along the spectrum. So the treatment process for those out of balance is entirely different because the principle is different. If a person who appears to be psychologically disturbed, I mean not insane, but psychologically disturbed, or in a state of neurosis or whatnot, the treatment for him is to bring him to recognize the divine absolute. And he begins to recognize the divine absolute by reintroducing into him the sense of balance. What destroys and corrupts the virtues, he says, is mainly laziness, but also love of comfort. And love of comfort distances people from others. It is, if you think about it, it is really a profound insight. The need for you to be in a state of physical comfort pushes you from intimacy, pushes you from being with others, makes you less of a human, in the sense less of a sharing person. He says that insan, the word insan, which in Arabic means a human being, is not derived from nisyan, which is usually the case, which is a person who forgets, i.e. he's forgotten his Lord, but is derived from a person who is seeking uns, which is intimacy. And love of comfort, love of physical well-being, in and of itself, pushes you towards distancing yourself, because it allows you, or it can sometimes lead you not to be sharing, not to be generous, not to be caring. And these are the attributes, these are the core of what a person is. So a person who puts the primacy of the physical is to a very large extent denying his humanity. And again, this is the principle along which the modern world is organized. It's organized along the principle of maximum individual comfort, against the natural requirement and need for balance and order that it needs intimacy. And of a healthy mind, he says that or near ma'rifah, keep the company of those like you. Recognize that your station is a gift from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And And it is really engineering of it, as it were. It is the technology of the inner self. And as the tariqah ways in which we try to collectively invoke, in which we try to enhance the ability of the enlightened mind to receive greater and greater illumination, is governed by actions such as dhikr, such as khalwas, such as communal. This also gives us, I believe, a recognition for ourselves. That is, when we start the process, when we are on the journey, we must always test the self, whether it is in or out of balance, and also dominate. And the forces that dominate us are, if we accept that they reflect the supremacy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, are these forces. And the purpose of these forces is to create unity within them, as well as a balance of preponderance over the kingly or lordly force. If we continue to look at the world from the perspective of the modern mind, the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will become infinitely more difficult, if not blocked, I believe. And the problem of modernist Muslims is that they accept the false science of the self, which is modern psychology. And this false science is, I believe, an impenetrable barrier to the path. It's possible, one can move along the path, and one should try. But that does not mean we should become antique in our thinking. But as it relates to enlightenment, as it relates to inner well-being, the modern mind must put the preponderance of the divine over the profane. And to do that, I think we will hit a roadblock very, very quickly. Great teachers, I think, used to accept that the person who comes to them seeking enlightenment, seeking wisdom, was in that balance, was to a very large extent in a state of balance. He wrote this book, I believe, in disgust at his earlier self, in the way that he conducted himself. While the majority of people, probably, after that time, were people who accepted, just as a statement of fact, the primacy of the divine. The absence of the sense of the sacred, in the modern mind, which permeates to those who may be very religious people too, is, I believe, a barrier. And if we do not overturn that, it will block our path. Of course, and Shaykh Fadhlla's book, Journey of the Self, parts of it are based on Ibn-Miskawayah, but it's elaborated and further. And the central theme is that. It's the rediscovery of a way of perception that was rooted in a society or in a system that accepted the primacy of the sacred. That system is now gone, and there's no point pretending it exists. It doesn't exist. I mean, the profane everywhere around us is in charge, including the so-called Muslims. And just this morning I was watching this Dubai TV. There are ads in there that are. It's not a question of their being un-Islamic. They are so modern in their concept and their notion of what values and what are the hierarchy of values, that it makes one really wonder. Who does these comments? Wow. Comments? What do you have to do?
You're talking about three causes. The last cause being love of comfort. Comfort. Shaykh Fadhlalla, whenever he talks about this, he pointed out something. He said that the word that in Islam.
Shaykh Fadhlalla said the only private place is the bathroom. It's called khala. Otherwise, hammam in Arabic, it does not mean this. It means a public place. It's a public place where people go for nobody took a shower. They went to the bath, public bath. But it is this constant chipping away. And the reality is this. The reality is what we have today. The reality is that Dubai TV this morning had a huge ad program on the Dubai Shopping Festival. 1 month, a festival shopping, 1 month of just shopping. Come to Dubai and shop. What do? You go from one air conditioning mall to the next. Then what do? You go to the next. And then you go to McDonald's.
Today I saw on the listening to the television program.
This
is about you.
I don't think, he does not say about such extreme conditions. These were extreme and highly, I think, very, very isolated conditions, even here. I was in this country, I first came to this country in 1958. Then I left. People were, these cases were not as prevalent and frequent as they are now. And it's part of the breakdown, not of families or values, it's the whole thing is being put upside down. And if there is no limit to one's appetite, except how it damages others, which apparently, and the space of defining damage is becoming more and more wider and broader. But I think in Islam, for example, cases like child rape cannot be, a person who is so badly damaged has to be treated also in other means. But if one can get him to see the action that happened to him or her, by emphasizing the tawheedi side, without them falling into excessive, degrees of religiosity or whatnot, I think there can be an element of a cure there. I mean, if the person who has suffered such terrible traumas is not over the edge in the sense that he is completely damaged, and therefore cannot be cured. The only way to do that, I believe, from an Islamic point of view, is you use these various mechanisms of the modern world, fine. But one of the toolkits is that if you can kindle in that person the sense of the divine, and therefore the need to be in balance with it, that may allow that person to overcome part or some of the heal. I mean, there's no question about the desacralization in the Muslim world. And it's happened, I was shocked really by the level of abuse. It was incredible. There's something called the Muslim helpline, Muslim women's helpline, kind of story that happened. So we can't say, well, the East is better or the East is more. The East frequently is much worse. But at least some of the parts of the building that the wrecking ball has missed are still intact there. Parts of them are.
Living the stories and characters.
Is that Ibn-Miskawayah wrote 1,000 years ago, and there has not been an updating of that, because that was a good guide of treating people until 50 years ago. But when people's mind becomes colonized, basically, or becomes disrupted, and modern Muslim psychologists are spending all their time in getting degrees from London University or wherever, it is highly improbable that you're going to get anything better than an Islamic perspective on Freud.
There's no universalized system that is a Bible in a book, but I disagree with the rest of the world.
I agree with you. This is the best and possibly the most effective mechanism of reintroducing balance into the modern mind. The modern world also has brought extreme situations and new situations and new problems that cannot be managed in that way. They have to be managed in a more continuous, rigorous and disciplined way. It's like, I suppose, the advance in herbal medicine. You cannot treat people now herbally the way that they did 1,000 years ago. There's been an accumulation of wisdom and knowledge about it. In the technology of the inner self, or the ethics of inner knowledge, which dovetails into the psychology of treatment and of cure. This has not happened. I mean, I've yet to see a book or insights by a person in Tawheed who wants to share his knowledge and wisdom that goes beyond Ibn-Miskawayah. It is basically that. It is or a certain variant of that. that one has exposed a broad number of people, large number of people, to a different perspective, and a truer perspective, in and of itself is good. But that perspective needs to be updated also, needs to be brought more into conditions of modern times. To answer modern questions, I mean one that Hyderkhana was talking about. That is, there are problems right now that were not there before. How do you treat it? The book is too small to give you all the answers.
Realization, realizing what is, the value of living.
Absolutely. For example, angry, very angry people who are also Murids, and very genuine Murids. This anger needs to be controlled and needs to be balanced. Somebody has to approach that in a focused, laser-like way. And I apply some of these things to myself, so I don't want to. These things are treated to a large extent by us within our own knowledge and understanding. But if you seek assistance, not necessarily counseling in the Western sense, but assistance, you can overcome, let's say, a state of anger while in this presence, while in the presence of like-minded people. But the reality is that you spend most of your time with unlike-minded people. So there is a need to maintain a certain focus and fulcrum in order to defeat these forces, or to control them. Of course, the best way is to do silent dhikr in these places.
Well, I just asked Shaykh Fadhlalla what to do if I was too angry, and he said he wouldn't.
I think we're all suffocated.
So there, you have to really want, you must want. From an individual perspective.
Which can feel like the same thing that was said there, to me sounds, if I applied half of that, even before man was made, the angels said, he would shed blood.
Modern times, obviously there was tyranny and authoritarianship and dominance and manipulation and love of grandeur and pleasure and all these things before. Nobody's denying that. But society was organized, even here I would say, at least it was in the 50s to some extent, in a way that maintained still a sense of otherworldliness and maintained a sense of the sacred. Now modern times, now contemporary times, are such where these have been destroyed. The physical manifestations of the true sense of the sacred have been destroyed. Left is either the echo or the shadow, but not the substance. In most post-Christian societies, I believe, it has gone. There's not a kind of spirituality, but it is not necessarily the spirituality that puts the divine on top, that puts the divine as head of the cosmic order. It's a different kind of spirituality. In our part of the world, well, and this is not my part of the world, but in the Muslim world, the so-called Muslim world, you have the shadow and the wholeness. There is nothing inside. The system is there's nothing inside. All of these are basically, the East is in a state of denial, the West is in a state of triumphalism. The West says we have now triumphed because our technology is not the technology of inner polishing that leads to the sense of it is, our technology leads to Microsoft. And that answer basically has dominated the reality of the world. The East denies it, or at least parts of the East deny it. They go, no, we are more virtuous, we are Islamic, our extended family is still intact. Every time we have lunch, we have it with our uncles. And the reality of the matter is just breaking up. That is not true. It is, we struggle, literally struggle, to have our weekly dinners with large members of our family, It's not because we don't want to have them every day, it's just not possible. The transport problems, distance problems, etc. The way that people organize their daily lives. So it's all this or that. Now, it is true that these answers are good for people who are well on the way, such as yourself, inshallah. But they're not useful for a person who is not in this circle. person who is not linked to a group, or is not linked to, or is linked to a group that is more concerned with outer actions, or more concerned with the minutiae of wudu and things like that. And there's no nourishment to it. How to bring that? How does that person get into a balance, given this bombardment that he's facing every day? I think it's very difficult, unless we have basically a new evolution in the way that we think. Modern
they have their line, and that's Islamic, and above that, you know, I mean, you
what you're saying.
With the modern-minded Muslim, is that they have a line.
The problem with modern-minded Muslims is that, I believe, is that they're basically secular. To them, Islam is an ideology. It's what they call an aqidah. And it's any Islamist, for example, or any person who's answer. This is what they say. They have accepted the principles of the secular world, except they like the socio-cultural stuff. And either they like that, the socio-cultural value that comes with wherever they came from, or they think of it as an ideological system, self-contained, self-consistent, appealing, rational, etc., etc.
Well, not, it has to be their one, it has to be separate.
What has that got to do with the way to Allah's plan? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. So you find very obviously pious people who pile themselves up with all kinds of drugs every time they have a cold. I've seen that. And it's this horrible contradiction between, wafting down Coca-Cola, right, and talking about Islam, and smoking Rothmans. It's really incredible. So these kinds of contradictions, to me, these people are of course, they are Muslims in the sense that they say the Shahada. It's not for me. Who am I to judge their true intention? They, as a community, are certainly not ones that are going to renew the deen, or renew the knowledge, inner knowledge needed to gain to certainty. Most of the people I know of that ilk. I'm not saying that we should have a modern-minded Muslim psychiatrist, God forbid. But it's the bringing some of the, especially issues of treatment and cure and diagnosis, slightly broader, or much broader, to cover greater spectrums of mental illness that afflicts us, or mental imbalance. Not necessarily madness. I mean, this is not used to my people. Sorry,